This is the fourth video in a series of 5 thinking about the book of 1 Corinthians. We've looked in the first at an introduction to 1 Corinthians, then we looked at chapters 1 to 4 and then 5 to 6, and here we're turning our attention to chapters 12 to 14. You'll notice in that I have unfortunately missed out quite a chunk. If you read through these chapters, you'll see Paul deals with a number of really important and pertinent issues for today. He addresses the issues of marriage and singleness. He speaks of food sacrificed to idols. He covers the issue of head coverings, or is it hair, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, and then the Lord's Supper. Unfortunately, because we wanted this to be 5 parts, I'm not going to dive into all of those, but I would encourage you to read Paul's letter for yourself and maybe get a good commentary alongside to help you understand what Paul is writing. Now here in chapter 12, Paul addresses the issue of spiritual gifts. If you can remember back to video number 2 it was, looking at chapters 1 to 4, we looked at Paul's greeting and how Paul's greeting introduces a number of themes that become important as the letter progresses. One of those themes was spiritual gifts. And in fact, Paul seems to commend the Corinthians, noting that they do not lack any spiritual gift. Now this is of course God's grace, not anything they've earned or done on their own effort. We might think, however, that Paul noting they've got no lack of spiritual gifts means that this section on spiritual gifts is going to be more positive. You know, all the other issues of sexual immorality, taking each other to court, even in terms of food sacrifice to idols and so on, they're making lots of mistakes and Paul has to bring lots of correction. We might think now we're getting towards the end of the book, maybe Paul's going to do a kind of praise, critique, praise sandwich, and he's going to commend them for these amazing spiritual gifts that they've got and the diversity and quantity that they are able to exhibit. But instead, as we turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 12, we see Paul's introduction is probably a little bit stinging for the Corinthian church. He writes this: "Now about the gifts of the Spirit, brothers and sisters, I do not want you to be uninformed," or some translations use the word ignorant. I do not want you to be uninformed. I do not want you to be ignorant. Now the Corinthian Christians prided themselves on their knowledge and their wisdom and their spiritual gifts. So the idea that in the area of spiritual gifts they might somehow be ignorant or uninformed was perhaps a little bit of a shock to them. I mentioned in a previous video how we do get the impression through 1 Corinthians that the Corinthian church had a slightly over-elevated sense of its own maturity and wisdom, and Paul has to help them to have a more sober and realistic assessment. But why is it that despite the abundance of spiritual gifts that the Corinthian Christians are able to use, Paul sees them as uninformed or ignorant? Well, we'll get there in a bit more depth in a moment, but we can see at the heart of the problem is a lack of love. That rather than using the gifts to build up others and be a blessing to others, the Corinthian Christians are using the gifts to bring honour and glory to themselves. And in order to correct the Corinthian Christians, Paul uses the metaphor or the image of the church as a body. And this is a brilliant image. It's actually an image that was quite prevalent in the time of Paul. And we can see why. It's a great image for encouraging individuals to see themselves as part of a whole. We all know that in order for the body to function, the different parts need to work well together. If the foot thinks, do you know what, I'm fed up of this, it just stops working, then the whole body is impacted, not just the foot. And so Paul is a genius here. We see elsewhere as well, if you do a bit of research into this, that Paul's brilliant in the images that he uses. They're so powerful and meaningful to the people that he's writing to. But interestingly, he doesn't just adopt this image of the body to urge the Corinthians to see themselves as part of a greater whole and to look to play their part in it. He also adapts this image. You see, for the Corinthian church, it's not just that they are a body or anybody. Rather, very profoundly, Paul describes them as Christ's body. And this description of the church as Christ's body means that there are a number of ways in which the church stands apart from its wider culture and the way that people did things in the wider Roman world. And one of the ways in which this is true relates to hierarchy. The Roman culture was very stratified. There was quite a strong hierarchy. There was very much the emperor at the top, and those who had wealth and status and power sat higher up, and those who were more kind of day labourers or slaves or women, they tended, other than if they were rich, to sit lower down the social hierarchy. And we see that when people use the body metaphor, more often than not, they use it in a way to urge each part to sort of stick to its place. They don't want, the foot thinking, I'm fed up of walking in the dirt, I'm going to jump up and sit on top of the head, for example. They want every part to stick to its place in this stratified hierarchy. Just to give you one example of this, there was a fable of the belly and its members. And this was a fable told in response to a group of kind of day labourers, poor day labourers, revolting against those who were in charge of them, those in power and who had wealth. And the fable of the belly and the members goes like this. Once there was a body, and their hands and their feet got fed up with the stomach, because the stomach just sits there and does nothing, and yet benefits from the labour of the hands and feet, as the hands and feet have to work really hard to give the stomach food. Therefore, the hands and feet have decided to rebel. They decided to stop their work. And what was the result? Well, the entire body died of starvation. The point of this fable is perhaps clear. It was a fairly direct message to these labourers that it might look as though the important people, the wealthy people, are just sitting there doing nothing, but their role is really important, and you've got to keep feeding them, or else if you don't, you'll be affected too. The whole body will die of starvation, including you. And it did seem that this fable worked, because in this particular instance, the labourers did go back to their labour. But you can see that in this use, it's very much everybody stick to their place. There's a kind of candid admission that the rich people don't really seem to do very much, but that's not the point. The point is they've got to play their role as rich people, sitting there not doing very much, just as the hands and feet have got to stick to their role. In contrast to this, if we read carefully what Paul argues in 1 Corinthians 12, we see that Paul subverts any sense of hierarchy that there might be. Ordinarily, the part that's got less honour should just continue to have less honour. But notice how Paul flips this around if I read chapter 12 and verses 22 onwards. We read this, I'll read from 21 actually. The eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you, and the head cannot say to the feet, I don't need you. On the contrary, those parts of the body that seem to be weaker are indispensable. And the parts that we think are less honourable, we treat with special honour. And the parts that are unpresentable are treated with special modesty, while our presentable parts need no special treatment. But God has put the body together, giving greater honour to the parts that lacked it, so that there should be no division in the body, but that its parts should have equal concern for each other. We see here that in contrast to a hierarchically stratified society, Paul is urging the body, the different members of the body, to elevate those that need elevating, and for those that already have a high place, to lower themselves. Those who are looked down upon, they need to be lifted up. And those who are already held in high esteem need to have the humility to lower themselves down. And this is radically countercultural in Paul's day, and would have been a challenge to the Corinthian church, where there is suggestion that something of that wider hierarchy had seeped in, that those who had more wealth or had the more seemingly impressive spiritual gifts saw themselves as more important. Now, we don't use the body as a metaphor in our wider culture in the way that it was prevalent in Paul's day, which in many ways maybe is a bit of a shame, because it's such a powerful metaphor for encouraging unity and people working together. And yet his metaphor is still really challenging, I think, for us as a church. It is very easy for all sorts of subtle hierarchies to seep into the church, whether that relates to wealth, at a subconscious level. Maybe those who give more to the church because they have better paying jobs are treated slightly differently. Or maybe there are certain talents or gifts that we somehow see as being more important to the function of the church, and so we put certain types of people on a pedestal, and other people we see as being somehow less significant and less valuable. Today, just as back in Paul's day, this metaphor of the church as Christ's body really challenges that. It encourages us to see every member of the church as equally indispensable, to see everybody's part as equally valuable, and to actively work to make sure that those, for whatever reason, who there's a temptation to look down upon, are actually lifted up. And if it's ourselves or others that are sort of over-elevated, to have the humility to lower ourselves down. Now, Paul then returns to this issue of spiritual gifts in chapter 14. But we've seen a number of slightly odd structures in 1 Corinthians so far. They're not really odd in Paul's context, but they can seem odd to us because we think in a different way now. But just as with 5 to 6, where we have sexual immorality and then people taking each other to court and then back to sexual immorality again, here we see a similar sort of structure where you've got spiritual gifts at the end, and you've got something else in the middle. And this thing in the middle is meant to shed light on the two things either side. And in this case, right in the middle of Paul's discussion of spiritual gifts is this wonderful hymn to love in 1 Corinthians chapter 13. Now, we often hear 1 Corinthians 13 in the context of a wedding. I'm sure it's familiar. It starts off, "If I speak in the tongues of men or of angels but have not love, I'm only a resounding gong or a clanging cymbal. If I have the gift of prophecy and can fathom all mysteries and all knowledge, and I have faith that can move mountains but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give all I possess to the poor and give over my body to hardship that I may boast, but do not have love, I gain nothing." I'll read some other parts of it in a moment. It is a beautiful portion of scripture. Now, it is very appropriate in a wedding to read 1 Corinthians chapter 13, and even for those who are married to try to sort of live up to this ideal of love and demonstrate the sort of love that is articulated in this passage is a challenge. But there is a bit of a danger if we only hear it in the context of a wedding, and that is that we miss actually quite a big layer of offence that comes through in this passage. Now, that may seem odd. What on earth could be offensive about a beautifully written hymn to love? Well, what's offensive about it, for the Corinthian Christians at least, is that if we read 1 Corinthians 13 in the context of 1 Corinthians as a whole, we see that everything that love is, the Corinthian church are not. And everything that the Corinthian church is, love is not. So, for example, the Corinthian church, as we looked at in a previous video, have got at least some among them who've got a tendency to boast. But love does not boast. In taking one another to court, the Corinthian Christians show themselves very much to be keeping a record of wrong. But love keeps no record of wrong. In seeking their own honour, we see the Corinthian Christians again, the opposite of love, which is not self-seeking. You might want to read through 1 Corinthians 13 with the rest of 1 Corinthians in mind and just see other ways in which there is something of a clear but indirect rebuke to the Corinthian church through this comparison of them with love that comes through. This is not just a challenge to the Corinthian church. I've heard people say it can be helpful to try to substitute your name in instead of the word love as a sort of audit for how you're getting on. So, can I say with any integrity that Helen is patient, that Helen is kind, that Helen does not envy, that Helen does not boast, that Helen is not proud? It's, if I'm honest, hard to say those things with integrity. I know there's still boasting and pride and envy that I can struggle with. And so this passage for us is really challenging. It can alert us to the ways in which our love doesn't yet hit the level of Christ's love. And of course, hitting the level of Christ's love is something that we're never going to be able to do on our own. What we need is for Christ's love to be evident in and through our lives through the power of his Spirit, to ask Jesus through his Spirit to love in and through us, that we might demonstrate more of his love to those around us. Paul, as I said, then does go back to the topic of spiritual gifts in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, and at this point is pretty practical. But it is this using the spiritual gifts with love that lies at the heart of the problems that Paul is addressing. And so in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, we get a glimpse into what using the gifts with a lack of love looks like in the Corinthian church. And the picture seems pretty chaotic. Paul has to urge those who are prophesying to make sure that if somebody else starts to prophesy, they stop what they're saying. Well, Paul having to say this implies that what's going on currently is everybody just trying to shout over the top of each other, enabling nobody to hear what's being said. But Paul makes really clear in 1 Corinthians chapter 14 that all of the gifts are not there for the individual just to kind of boost their own self-image or have others respect them or think they're somehow really clever or really good. The gifts are there for the benefit of the church. And therefore, if there is to be any hierarchy of gifts, it is ordered such that those that are most of a blessing and most beneficial to others are those that are higher up. And this is why, although Paul himself is pleased that he speaks in tongues, he sees it as an important gift and he himself prays in tongues, he actually puts it lower down than prophecy, because unless somebody interprets, nobody can understand what the tongue speaker is saying. Whereas prophecy is clear. It's in a language that people can understand and can therefore feel the conviction that comes when a word is given that has insight. Elsewhere in Paul's writings, he speaks of teaching as well as being a really important gift in order for people to be built up, to understand the truths of the gospel in greater depth, and to have a faith that's not just based on experience, but based on robust truth and understanding as well. Well, I hope that little exploration of 12 to 14 has encouraged you to dig a little bit deeper. But let me just finish again with some words from 1 Corinthians 13, and this will set us up well for the final video in 1 Corinthians 15. Because as I read these final verses of 1 Corinthians 13, you'll see that Paul starts to point ahead. And this is something he did in the greeting again. You can remember I pulled that out as a theme. Paul encouraging the Corinthians not just to focus on the here and now, but to look ahead, to be staring forward to that day when Christ returns and live in response accordingly. So he says this: love never fails, but where there are prophecies, they will cease. Where there are tongues, they will be stilled. Where there is knowledge, it will pass away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when completeness comes, what is in part disappears. When I was a child, I talked like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I put the ways of childhood behind me. For now we see only a reflection as in a mirror. Then we shall see face to face. Now I know in part, then I shall know fully, just as I am fully known. And now these three remain: faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love.